my last video I discussed the courante, which in the context of a Baroque suite often precedes or sometimes follows the Baroque dance I will be discussing in this video, which is the Sarabande. As mentioned in the previous video, keep in mind these videos are being made in conjunction with the release of my own Baroque suite for 2 violins on iTunes. The purchase link to the sheet music and EP are in the description. Also, make sure to watch the previous videos on Baroque dance forms if you haven't yet, as each video builds off of information I've already discussed. The Sarabande is historically a lot more enigmatic than the dances I have presented so far, as its origins are still mired in a great deal of mystery. Depending on the source and even the time in which the source was written, the dance is either of Spanish, New World, or Middle Eastern origin. While I don't want to get into all of these theories, the most convincing explanation in my opinion is that the Sarabande originated in the Spanish colonies of the New World, as the oldest documented reference to a sarabande, referred to in the Spanish Sarabande, is found in a manuscript from Panama dating to 1539. Determining whether the dance was taken to the New World by Spaniards or their slaves, or even developed through an amalgam of indigenous Native American dances that melded with Spanish folk dances, is not my goal in this video. In fact, so sparse is the information about the exact origins of the Sarabande that any further etymology of the word Sarabande beyond its stemming from the Spanish word Sarabanda is unknown. What we do know about the Sarabande's beginnings is that the dance the music was meant to accompany was initially considered so salacious and erotic that it was banned outright in Spain by the late Renaissance. But as with many things in history, the act of banning it just seemed to make it even more popular in Spain, and by extension later the entire European continent. Some early sources referred to Spanish sarabandas as being recited as poems in a singing fashion, often with rather inappropriate foul-mouthed and erotic subject matter. A lot of the early sources surrounding the salacious and obscene nature of the Renaissance sarabanda seem a far cry from the stately and serious nature of the Baroque sarabande, but I find it interesting nonetheless and worth a mention. As for the tempo of the sarabande, it isn't as obvious as one might think. The initial and standard definition is that sarabandes are slow in tempo. However, this wasn't the case for all sarabandes, even up through the late Baroque. As with the courante, 2 forms came into being, with quicker sarabandes being the choice of Italian, Spanish, and some English composers. While French and German composers opted for a slow tempo. However, to me it seems quite clear that the quick sarabande was the stylistic loser of the Baroque era, while the slow sarabande reigns supreme in the minds of most to this very day. Even when Grieg wrote his neo-Baroque Holberg suite, he himself opted for a slow sarabande, showing that whether its origins were quick in tempo or not, the slow sarabande became the standard. So if there are 2 distinct tempo possibilities for a sarabande, what are the determining factors that make a sarabande? I will highlight the 2 most important. First is the use of triple meter, as sarabandes are mostly written in 3/4 or 3/2 time. Of course, there are exceptions, with some sarabandes being in 6/4 or 3/8 time, and even some early Spanish sarabandas being in 6/8 time. But to keep things simple, let's stick to the most common time signatures being 3/4 or 3/2 time. The other determining characteristic of the sarabande is its rhythm. These 3 rhythms here seem to be the seed rhythms to most Baroque sarabandes, whether in a fast or slow tempo. The first and second examples show in my opinion one of the more important aspects of sarabande rhythms, which is the stressing of the second beat, which most sarabandes make good use of. In contrast to the allemande and courante, the sarabande does not make use of an upbeat. But in similarity to the allemande and courante, sarabandes end each section on an unstressed beat, thus once again making use of the female ending. While ending on the second beat of 3 seems to be the standard, I have seen many of them also end on the third beat, but the safest course of action to follow is to end on the second beat, as this mirrors the sarabande's nature of emphasizing the second beat. Musically, sarabandes are marked by a heavy reliance on a series of chords, in contrast to the courante and allemande that often make use of moving voices. Sarabandes often rely on almost chord progression-like passages to present the musical material. This chord progression-like characteristic will make an important mark on the forms composers often employ to write sarabandes. The most popular of these progressions being the La Folia progression, which I will outline in an upcoming Principles of Music video. When it comes to the formulaic rules on how to structure a sarabande, there are a few courses of action a composer can take. Most of these techniques revolve, however, around working off an initial 8-bar phrase that presents a simple chord progression with some ornamentation. This 8-bar progression is then repeated, after which a composer has several options on how to proceed. The simplest way is to employ the most rudimentary version of binary form and have another 8 bars in the B section of contrasting musical material. Another way is to follow the initial progression with variations of the progression as Handel does in his famous D minor sarabande. This technique also falls into the same realm as employing a double or two, which follow a repeating 8-bar sarabande. Another way is the method which Bach uses to compose most of his sarabandes. It consists of first presenting the 8-bar sarabande that repeats, after which one might on the surface postulate that a slightly longer repeating B section follows in binary form. However, it's somewhat more nuanced, as the B section is divided into 2 parts. Bach follows this approach in almost every sarabande he wrote, as he first presents the 8-bar sarabande as usual, after which in the B section follows 2 differing sets of 8 bars. So in a way, one could map out Bach's form as such. It seems he opts for establishing the key in the first 8 bars, whereby he ends in the dominant, after which he continues in the dominant in the first 8 bars of the B section, whereafter he modulates into a related key in the second 8 bars, eventually bringing us back to the original key by the end of the B section. I like Bach's approach as it's straightforward and lays out a good scaffold off of which one can build a sarabande. Eventually, the characteristic of slow sarabandes, often residing in the middle of Baroque suites, came to influence later composers who used a slow movement as one of the middle movements of classical and romantic sonatas or symphonies. Haydn makes this connection obvious by literally writing a sarabande as the slow movement of his piano sonata in D major, although he doesn't specify it as a sarabande, as doing so would have been somewhat old-fashioned even in his time. Here we see once again that a form considered dead held esteem well beyond its expiration date. This highlights the importance of why understanding old forms can be useful for a composer. So let's briefly run over the defining characteristics of the sarabande again. They are written in a triple meter, possess no upbeat, are mostly written in a slow tempo, they end each section with female endings, they often stress the second beat, and they employ binary or variation form based around 8-bar phrases. I hope this video served as a good introduction to the sarabande, and look forward to discussing the gavotte in my next video. Also, don't forget to check out my own suite linked in the description.